Great.
Okay. Thank you everyone for participating this evening. I need to give several disclaimers right from the onset. The first and most important one is that I am actually not an expert on this topic. I am very honored to have the opportunity to discuss what I believe to be a very important Jewish practice, uh, salient mitzvah in the way that we think about the world with you this evening. But don't think that I have all the answers. I do not. But please do ask questions, and I'll keep a running log of all the questions that come up. If I don't have the answer handy, I'll be obviously very happy to follow up and make sure to get back to you. If there are so many questions that I can't answer, which is definitely possible, then we may decide to run a follow-up session after this one to deal with some of the questions that we didn't get to tonight. So let us now begin. I'm going to share my screen over here and put up a PowerPoint. Wait, I can't. Jim, you got to give me screen sharing privileges here. Still not there.
1 second, after that, I'm going to give it to you.
Oh, thank you, Jason. Right. Am I the only host?
Here now?
Yeah, I can screen share, but I appear to have the control over the waiting room. So you want to make sure to keep yourself as co-host.
Yeah,
right.
I'm still co-host, so I can still let people in.
Fantastic. All right, so let's get into this then. Okay. So let's start over here. What we're talking about tonight, of course, is mainly the process of performing a Tahara. And our primary goal for the evening is to discuss some of the details, some logistics really, about how to go about doing that in the best possible way and how to ensure that we have uniform standards for our community. But there's really a lot more to be said about the topic than just that. This is not simply which is just a performance-based mitzvah, but there's a lot of values that are implicit within everything that we do over here. There are some things, and we'll talk about as we go forward here, that are straightforward halacha. In other words, they are written out in the books of Jewish law, and there's as much halacha as the halachot pertain to the rules of kasher, what kind of combinations of milk and meat are allowed to be eaten, which ones aren't, what size fence you have to put up on your roof, what brachot you make in what sequence when you're eating foods. I mean, there's all sorts of halachot that fall into that category, and there are some aspects of what we're doing over here that are in that realm. And then there's a good deal of what goes on in the world of the Tahara that actually really lives within the world of minhag exclusively. And when I say it lives within the world of minhag, what I mean by that is that it's not as if a minhag, a custom, is a no-stakes game. But it means that identifying absolutes, wrong or right, and even having tools with which to evaluate what is better or not better practices is very, very fuzzy, as we'll discuss moving forward here. So let us begin with some general comments about the whole concept of kavod hamet. So the idea of honoring the dead, I mean, there is something which I think is worth focusing on before we actually get into the procedures over here. The whole process of honoring the dead is in some sense an absurdity. I'm sure everybody recognizes that. I should also mention at this point that if anybody does have a question, I'm trying to keep an eye on the boxes here. But if Jason or somebody else could also do me the service of making sure to monitor for questions, and let me know when somebody's got something to add or to ask, please, that would be very helpful as well. All right, so the whole concept of doing things for the honor of the deceased, in other words, for the body of the deceased after a person has passed on, is in a way, obviously, an absurdity. On a biological level, once life has ceased, the body can't detect anything, and not to be too crass about it, but there really should not be much of a difference between a dignified washing and an undignified one, between a dignified burial and a simple disposal of what is now nothing more than a collection of what used to be cells and is now just organic material in a seemingly orderly mass. But the halacha doesn't look at it that way, and Jewish wisdom doesn't look at it that way, and for several reasons, we do not allow ourselves to think about the deceased as simply a pile of organic matter. Instead, we look at that deceased person, as we're going to see going forward here. Now, if you look here at this source from the Gemara, which is as good as any to start with, this is Gemara in the 3rd chapter of Masechet Brachot. It's talking about honoring the dead. But but it's not even talking about something as close to honoring the dead as what we will be doing here, demonstrating here tonight, as what we do with the Chevra Kadisha. We're talking here about somebody who is molich atzamot mimakom lamakom. In other words, a person has died a long time ago, and the person is now carrying bones from one place to another, transporting what was once long ago a living person, but now is really just the relic of a person that was. Don't put them in the trunk, essentially. Don't sit on them. Don't look at them as baggage. That would be disgraceful. That would be disgraceful. Says the Gemara about this, the Gemara makes an analogy, and it's a very helpful one for thinking about why it is that we do what we do with the Chevra Kadisha. The same rules that apply to the bones of the deceased person. Remind everybody to mute themselves to make sure we don't get any feedback, particularly if you got two different computers on in the same room. The bones of a deceased person are compared in this Gemara to a Sefer Torah. The Sefer Torah, the scroll in which the Torah is written, obviously is one of our most sacred items. We look at this with reverence. We see it as something with absolute value, and we see it as something that is worth more than the parchment on which it is written. It is not just a collection of organic material, even though, of course, it is. The order that is within it gives us a sense of something much more important. And we say that the same thing is true over here about a Sefer Torah and about a person who has passed away. So when we think about what we do with the deceased, it's appropriate for us to remind ourselves that the person who is here in front of us was, and continues to be a Sefer Torah. And the same kind of respect that we would afford to a Sefer Torah in its use, we should afford to the person who has passed away. And the same kind of care and caution that we would force ourselves to put forward when dealing with repairing or in some way dealing with the Sefer Torah in any way, we should do over here as well. The Gemara goes on a couple more lines and says, Im halveu mascharo, if a person does accompany the dead, does show proper honor, what is that akin to? Allah v'katav omer, amalveh Hashem chanudal, amchabdo chanen avyon. Right? The Gemara quotes two psukim from Mishlei, both of which say that these gestures of dignity towards the deceased are really not about the deceased at all. They are instead gestures of dignity towards Hashem, towards God, towards the Creator. And so the fact that the person who has passed away is now looked at in the language of Mishlei as a dal and an evyon, a poor person, a pauper, a person who is without recourse to take care of themselves, does not in any way absolve us of the responsibility of treating the person as a person, right? And not just as a person who can forego his dignity, but as a person who is now akin to a Sefer Torah. The Chatam Sofer makes this point even more strongly. No, too far. There we go. By quoting a pasuk over here, which really drives the point home. The whole idea of burial is described in the Torah not with respect to the pious. It's not that the Torah says that after Tzaddik passes away, after Moshe, Aaron pass away, they get buried. They do. The Torah doesn't use that as an exemplar to describe the mitzvah of burial. Instead, the Torah talks about criminals and says a person who dies a criminal is buried. Kavar tikbareno bayomahu. You must bury that person immediately. And so we don't actually get to make any value judgments about how the person lived. The fact that the person was a person means that they continue to be a person. The fact that the person was a Jewish person means that they continue to be a Sefer Torah. You look at the language of the Chatam Sofer over here. Bnei Yisrael ma'aminim ki adam ki yamut ba'ohel. Gam ki adam ki yamut ba'ohel. Last week's parsha, when a person dies, adayin b'moto nikra adam pnimi. That person is still on the inside called a person. V'lo peger, as it translates into Yiddish, a corpor, a corpse. Ki gam b'gufo shayan yirtak nartikle neshama nisharbo lichluchi kedusha. That body, which was the vessel that held the soul, retains some element of sanctity. And so this is the thing that we have to remind ourselves all the time. There is a person here. There's a person on the table. There's a person who's being submerged in the mikvah. There's a person who's being dressed. There's a person who's being put into the casket. There is a person there, an adam. It is not a cadaver. It is not a collection of cells. It is a person. And, I was doing a Tahara recently with somebody who, I won't mention his name, but he said, he likes, when performing a Tahara, to think of himself on the table and ask himself, how would I want to be treated? It's not a bad idea, I don't think, to think of it in that terms if one is capable of it. But it's not essential. We don't have to ask ourselves, how would we want to be treated? That's a good thing to think about, but we should just ask, how should a person be treated in this situation, right? And that's where we proceed, and that's how we get into this moment where we deal with the Tahara. So most of you who are on today have performed Taharas before, either here or somewhere else. A few of you I know have not and are just interested in the concept of the Chevra Kadisha. So I'll go through in some generalities how things are actually done in the Tahara room, and we'll take a little tour in there if the cell network allows for it. If the 5G is strong enough down here, I'll get on there with the phone. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm sorry I'm stationary with the computer because we only are functioning on a wired network. We'll get into the Tahara room. I'll show you how we protect ourselves from the potential of contagious illness. It is quite safe, I believe, to perform a Tahara on a physical level. What it does emotionally, somebody else who knows more about that can speak to. Maybe Sonia will give a session on it at some point. But the physical aspects of it we can discuss here tonight, and we'll talk about the logistics, about how it actually goes. But through it all, let us remember that this is the mindset, right? A Tahara is a serious thing. It's a serious thing that we are doing as a final gesture of dignity towards a person, the very last intimate contact that anybody will have with this person in this form. And so we can't allow ourselves to ever think of this as simply a pedestrian moment, as something that we just do. It is critical. All right, to this point, any questions or comments that anybody wants to add? All of you know that, based on the description in the email, that I have a good deal of experience performing Taharas here in this community, but many of you have lots of experience also. And if anybody wants to share a thought at this point, please do so. I'll give you 2 seconds to figure out if you want to respond or not. All right. All right. Then we're good to proceed. We've said everything that needs to be said. Okay. So now let's talk about the actual process. What will happen, those of you who have done this before, of course, know that the first thing that happens is you get an email saying a Tahara is needed this evening. Historically, I don't know, how long this goes back in this community. We use 4 volunteers. Apparently, in Yerushalayim, 6 is the norm. 4 is a good number. 3 is fine too. If we get to the point where we are really desperate for volunteers, Rachel is quite good at drumming up extra support. But of course, we could use more volunteers to make sure that we can get up to that 4 number every single time. So you'll get an email, you'll respond with the time. We typically do Taharas at night. We try to do a Tahara always close to the time of burial. Not immediately before, of course, we don't want there to be problems that will prevent the burial from taking place in a timely fashion, but we try to do it close to the time of the burial. And the reason for that is fairly simple. If we were to do the Tahara well in advance, even if we do it 1 day in advance, for whatever reason the funeral is being delayed, so family can show up or what have you, there's the possibility that things could go wrong with the person afterwards. And so we try to do it close to the time of the burial, which typically means we're doing it in the later part of the evening, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night would be fairly standard. So you get an email, you show up, come here or to our place on Summer Street, and then you get into the process. So the first things that we got to think about here when we get into the Tahara process is simply protecting ourselves. And in this room, which I'll see if I don't think I can get over there. Let me switch to this one. This process is a little, oh gosh. This process is a little more cumbersome than I wanted it to be, but we'll make do with what we got over here. You guys see me? I think I have to turn off the screen sharing over here in order to get it. It's not worth it. That's what I'm realizing now. It is not worth it. All right. This. Okay. So the first thing we do, of course, is we make sure that we have proper protective equipment. We got, obviously, all of us got lots of schooling in the whole concept of PPE 2.5 years ago when it was all over the news. But those who were involved in Taharas were quite acquainted with this stuff beforehand. We have the full complement of protective gear over here. We have gloves, we have gowns, we have booties that go over our shoes. As we'll see when we get into the Tahara room, there can be a lot of water involved in this process, and it's important that water can potentially be contaminated, so it's important to make sure that we protect ourselves from whatever might be in there. We have face shields, which can be very important, bonnets, the full gamut. The thing about these surgical things, let me pull some of them over here so you can see them.
Rabbi Wolf, are you aware that we can't see you?
Yeah. I had to go off screen for a second to get some supplies. I'm I'm tethered to a wired connection here, so I can't get as far over there as I'd want to be. So it goes, that's life.
There you go.
Rabbi Israel, remind me afterwards, and I'll tell you a nice Chabad-related joke about the line I just said. All right. Anyway, we have masks of this sort. These things are very effective for keeping particles off of our faces. We've got gloves, as you can see over here, full body gowns, full leg coverings, the full set of protective equipment. Now, even though, of course, as I started by saying, the deceased that we have in the room with us is a person, that person is no longer susceptible to disease. Right, we're not trying to protect that person from us. We are, of course, and particularly in the era in which we live, we're trying to protect ourselves from each other. We are in close contact with each other, and so we want to make sure that in case somebody does come in with some kind of contagious disease, we don't pick it up from one of our fellow Chevra Kadisha members. But it's really not essential to make sure that the body does not get contaminated with any diseases from us. So the direction of contamination is a little bit different. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is that there are certain steps that we could take to make sure that we're totally insulated. During the COVID period, the funeral home here was providing us with full-on hazmat suits to keep everything completely separated. We don't really think that's necessary. I know that Rabbi Zon has said in the past he doesn't even think that wearing a mask is particularly essential when performing a Tahara. We have always taken to wearing masks. Again, the masks with the face shields are almost always in good supply over here to be able to be used for this purpose. And it's very important also when you come into the Tahara room for the first time, and we'll put together a more elaborate checklist on this going forward to make sure that it's there for each and every Tahara, to make sure that there's a sufficient number of gloves. It's very likely, it's almost certain, you'll have to change your gloves at some point during the Tahara, and it's very likely that you have to change it more than once, depending on how the process actually unfolds. And so there are always ample supplies, but sometimes they're hidden. And it's, before you start anything, before we remove the sheet that covers the body, we want to make sure that everything is in place. The greatest level of dignity, of course, is afforded by having everything prepared, by having a shulchan aruch, everything set, so that you don't need to be scrambling at the last moment for things. So before the Tahara begins, we make sure that we have all of our PPE in place. We make sure that we have the tachrichen. The tachrichen are supplied boxes such as these. And we'll open up the box out later, and I'll show you what's actually inside of here for those who haven't seen it, and I'll show you some details about how we use them for those who have. And did I lose my screen sharing? I did. I don't know why. And we also, in the case of a man's tahara, we have a talus. The talus does not need to be kosher. In fact, it needs to not be kosher. It is okay if the talus was kosher originally. If it's somebody who is an active member of a synagogue community who has passed on, then we try to get hold of their own talus that they used in their lifetime to perform the wrapping of the body in there. But if not, we will just use whatever talus we have available. This talus is rendered pasul before we begin, and this is one of those things that should be done before the Tahara actually starts. Take one of the strings, cut it off, and do not discard the string. We have a use for it, which we'll get to later. So those are the things you want to make sure you have in advance. Count out the tachrichim, lay them out in an orderly fashion on the side of the aron, on the side of the casket, and then you can proceed from there to making sure you have all the rest of the material. So in addition to the actual dressing of the body, there's also a couple of extra materials that we use. We place, as we'll talk about later, when we get to the stage, we place earth from Eretz Yisrael, which comes in little pouches that say Afar Eretz Yisrael on it, dirt from Israel. We place those on strategic places on the body. And we also place shards of broken pottery. Now, both of these things, and we'll talk about this more shortly, but both of these things are symbolic to represent the idea that the burial is really supposed to take place in the earth. There is a shortcoming that we know we have in all of the burials that we do outside of Israel, which is that we use a casket. In Israel, by and large, burial is done straight. The body is placed into the shroud is placed into the ground. Full stop. No casket whatsoever. The barrier of the casket creates a little bit of a problem in halakha because the burial is supposed to be done in the ground. Now, the casket is made out of decomposable material, and eventually that body will be in contact with the ground. But as a gesture to indicate that we have fulfilled the Torah's mitzvah of kavortik barenu ba'aretz, that we're supposed to do burial in the ground, we take pieces of dirt. The fact that the dirt comes from Israel is presumably related to some extra degree of holiness or something like that that's associated with the land of Israel. But we want to make sure these things are in place before we start. Now, to be clear about this, there are some things in this list that are essential, and there are some things that are not. It is essential in every burial to have tachrichin. It is not essential to have all of the tachrichin. If for one reason or another, one of the tachrichin is not available, then the tahara can proceed. Now, we would definitely always take pains to make sure that we have everything there. But if for whatever reason it becomes impossible to get access to one, then across the board, pretty much every halachic source that I can identify agrees the tahara and the burial on time is more important than having every single one of the tachrichim in place. The talit, again, not absolutely essential. There must be some covering around the body. The one thing which is absolutely essential is that whatever we use to cover the body in, that it be completely 100% clean. And so the use of the tachrichin as we have them is the best way of going about that. But there's nothing particularly magical about these tachrichin. Would it come to pass that these were not available, and the only thing we could do is go to Target and buy a white sheet, then that is what we would do. But in a conventional situation, it should not be necessary. The shards also, we like to use these things. They're deeply symbolic, but if they're not available, they're not available. Some of you might know I got myself into trouble by being overly exuberant with this once upon a time, so I've learned my lesson. The shards in the earth are not absolutely essential. We use them when they are available. We try to get a hold of them to our own inconvenience for sure, but not to the point of postponing the burial. So those are something to bear in mind. All of that is as far as the things that are sort of come from the outside. So we have our PPE, we're ready to go. We've got ourselves suited up. We have our tachrichin. We've got our shrouds. We have our talit, which we've made it puzzle. We make sure we have all the material that we need going in. Now we get into the logistics of the actual burial, the actual washing. And for the purposes of the washing, we need to make sure that we have buckets and cups. And I'll get them again. I'm going to have to walk away for a second. I'll be right back. So we have these style buckets, which are, I think, primarily sold for mopping use, but they do the job over here as well, and washing cups. And we'll talk shortly about why it is we need these things, but it's necessary, at least some level, to have something that can be used for pouring water. It's advisable to make sure that these things are in place before we start and that we have sufficient quantities of whatever we need. In addition to that, we need a bunch of other stuff, towels. Oftentimes we need scissors for cutting through either bandages or clothing that is not easily removed. Sometimes we need solvents to get off things like nail polish or adhesive residue or ink that might be on the body. We should have a good supply of acetone in the closet over here that usually works very well for this purpose. There's a variety of soaps in there as well, some Goo Gone. Those things are always helpful. And then sometimes we have occasion to use glue to hold wounds together to make sure that they don't bleed. And there's a product called Webril, which we'll talk about later, which is very helpful for controlling seepage. And then finally we have the nail picks, and we'll talk about these things in turn. And the last thing that we want to make sure that we have in our inventory of supplies is the card with the tefillot on it. That we have over here. We have it at this particular location. It's in a plastic sheet. In the other location, we have it in a little laminated card. And so those are the materials. Once we have all those materials, we're ready to start proceeding to actually interacting. And so on the other side of preparation, it's valuable to make sure that, of the group of participants who are there, somebody is appointed as the one who makes decisions. Oh, in almost every Tahara, there's some decision to make. Some decision about some logistical aspect which becomes challenging, or at least there's multiple directions in which it could go. And I'll talk about a few of those as we get to them, but it's not always going to happen, but it's very, very helpful to decide in advance that somebody has got the gospel on this. In the language of the Sefer Gesher HaChaim, he says you should appoint the oldest person to be the leader on this. I know that it's not always dignified to ask for people's ages, so I would say go with who your gut says is the most seasoned in the world of Taharas. The person who's either performed the most, been involved with the most different communities, or has the most gravitas in the group. It's not really an official appointment, and certainly it's not something that endures beyond the particular Tahara that you're in. Nobody could possibly get an inflated head over this kind of an appointment. So appoint somebody who's going to be in charge, and then one of the volunteers who's here, one of the members of the Chevra, hopefully it would be, at least one of the people there is capable of reading and understanding the content of the tefillot, should be appointed as the reader. It's not necessary to have the same person be in both of these roles. One person can be the director of the Tahara, and another person can be the reader, but it is necessary that there be no confusion about who's doing what. And once all these things are assigned, we wash our hands in the standard Netilat Yadayim fashion, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, 3 times, and then we put on gloves. If there is a shomer present, as there often is, discuss with the shomer about how long you think the Tahara will take. Usually 45 minutes to an hour is very average, unless it's particularly complicated, so that the shomer knows that he can have a little bit of a reprieve, and know when the shomer is supposed to be back and who is supposed to retrieve him. Make sure there's a plan in place with the shomer. Write the name down. Rachel is usually very good about providing us with the Hebrew name of the deceased. The legal name is always going to be given on whatever documentation is present. There'll be a toe tag, there'll be a tag on the bag, there'll be something that has got the legal name on there. And that is obviously very important, but in addition to that, we want to make sure that we know the person's Hebrew name to the best of our abilities, to be able to use it in the context of the tefillot, which do make specific reference to the individual as an individual. And again, that goes back to the point that we started with, which is that the person who is in front of us is still a person with an identity, and that identity is tied in our minds to their Jewish identity more than it is to their identity as a legal person who, in the eyes of American law, has ceased to be a person already, some time before we got into the room with them. And we have some paperwork, not much, that should be filled out indicating who the volunteers are, what date the Tahara was done, and where. So all of that, it's best to do all this stuff in advance, and all of this is done before actually going into the Tahara room. And by having all this stuff done in advance, what it does is facilitate the feeling that the Tahara is the Tahara. What's happening in the room is happening for the person who is in there, and it's not a business operation where whatever needs to be done gets done. It's a personal operation that's done with care and with focus on the person who is on the table. So that's as far as preparation goes. Okay. Sorry there. There we go. All right. So let me get into the actual logistics. So when we get into the Tahara room, now the question is it worth trying to bring the computer in there? I don't think it's possible. You can kind of move the camera around and see where it is. I think this is as far as I can go. So you can see there's a room over there where the Taharas are performed, but that's about as good as I'm going to be able to do given the technical limitations that we have here tonight. So the Tahara room has a table in it, and a mikvah, which is it's not a kosher mikvah in the sense that it's been filled with naturally flowing water or water which was collected without the use of tools, but it is a pool of water, and it's a pool of clean water that I believe is supposed to be refilled after each time. I mean, I know it's supposed to be. I believe it is in fact refilled after each use. So when we get into the Tahara room, on the table is always a body bag. In almost every situation, the body will already be placed on the table. And when you open the bag, you find inside a person who is typically dressed in a hospital gown, much more rarely in civilian clothes, depending, of course, on the circumstance of the death. And once you open that bag, honestly, you don't know what you're going to find. Very often, you open the bag and you find that the person died serenely, and there's limited to no medical equipment, no invasive actions that were taken to try to save the person's life, no signs of decay, no problems whatsoever. And sometimes you open the bag and you find that you have a challenging situation. You have a person whose death was traumatic, or you have a person who died in the course of experiencing attempts to save that person's life, or you have a person who is in late stages of a disease that caused either great suffering or some emaciating tendencies on the body. And sometimes when you open the bag, you just don't know what you're going to get. Typically, if there's a major situation, a real traumatic situation, you will be notified in advance so that we can avoid triggering real hard trauma for people who may have experienced some similar loss in their life, in their personal lives. But you never know. So before we open the bag, we got to steel ourselves and remember that there's a mitzvah to be done. The mitzvah is kavod hamet, and no matter what, this is a person who right now deserves honor and dignity, which means that it cannot be emphasized enough. We need to control ourselves and refrain from comments, from remarks, which don't respect adequately the gravitas of the moment. This is a serious thing, and it's a serious feeling that's going on right there, and that the person needs to know, to the extent that the person can know, that we care. I should mention, I thought I'd mention this in the beginning, but it slipped my mind. In addition to the Chatam Sofer's approach, which says, we look at this person as a person because of, again, he calls it the fact that this was a vessel that previously held life means that now it's the equivalent of a Sefer Torah, that once it held the words of the Torah, continues to be sacred forever. There's another view which is espoused in the Zohar and other Kabbalistic sources that says that the soul of the body is actually present in the room together with the people performing the Tahara, which then means that obviously it's not just a person, but it's a person who's literally watching you and waiting for you to do something for it. The Zohar even goes farther than that and says that in this moment, this disembodied soul is particularly susceptible to loneliness and to emotional attacks, and therefore it's doubly important to be sensitive to the needs of that soul. It's worth thinking about, even if the Chatam Sofer and other halachic sources don't necessarily say it outright. So you open the bag, and when you open the bag, the very first thing you do is assess the situation. Get a sense of what is really going to need to be done here, right? How much of a tahara is going to be performed. In an extreme situation, we may curtail some aspects of the washing, as we'll talk about in a moment. In a mild situation, we may realize that there's very little to be done. In a situation where there's odor to be controlled, we have tools for that as well, which, if anybody's ever in that situation, we'll talk about the details of it. But in every situation, the first and most important thing is to get an assessment of what needs to be done, and then to start doing it. And the first thing that we do in the doing of the things is recite some tefillah. There's a beautiful tefillah. It's called Chamol, have compassion. And the tefillah, it appeals to God to have compassion upon the soul of the deceased, to remember the good deeds that were done in the life of that person who passed away. The tefillah is allegedly written originally by Hillel HaZaken, famous Hillel from the Talmud, and it contains the word rachamim 7 times. And as we'll talk about soon, the number 7 comes up a bunch in the process of performing the Tahara, and 7, as anybody who knows anything about Judaism knows, is a number that indicates completion. And so the Chamol starts with 7 cycles of rachamim, 7 cycles of mercy. Obviously, no situation of death is ever great. Once a person has died, there's sadness, there's a feeling of obviously loss, and that something is wrong that cannot be righted. And so we, performing the Tahara, we stand there and we reject that, and we say, no, this is a gesture of grace that we at this moment can perform for this person, and we ask God to be our partner in this by giving us this sense of compassion for the person who has passed away. Where we started again. There's an absurdity that goes on in here, and we are working hard to convince ourselves that what we are doing is important, because we believe that it is. The Tefillah of Chamol is said as soon as the body is being prepared to be uncovered. Now, in the text of the card as we have it, it says the Chamol, before the washing, and then while removing the covering sheet, we have another line which comes from Zechariah, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, which indicates, that we're about to start the process of the washing. I think even though the way it's worded on the card says that should be done before removing the covering sheet, it really makes a lot more sense to say remove the covering sheet, and then once you can see the person, say the Chamol prayer, and then as the garments are beginning to be removed, cutting through the shirt or the sleeves or unsnapping or whatever is there, that's the right time to say the Vaya'an Tefillah. There's a lot of sort of coordination that goes into this, but with a little bit of practice, we can actually get it right. So as you're performing the washing, we try to give preferential treatment to the right-hand side in all things, and the top part of the body in most things, we'll talk about later. So we start at the head, we move down to the neck, the shoulders, the arms, the torso, the legs. And then we do the right side of the back and the left side of the back, starting at the top of the head on the right side of the back, and then moving down towards the feet, starting at the left side of the head on the back, and moving again down towards the feet. The washing is always done with towels to the best of our ability. There are some cases where it's just not practical to use towels and we have to pull out the hose in order to actually wash off whatever is there. The reason to use towels mostly is to indicate some level of tzniut, right? If we think of this person as a person, we don't in our lives typically touch people without asking for permission first. And so we demonstrate some degree of compassion and honor and dignity for the person who's passed away by using towels to wash instead of washing with our bare hands. We have always a good supply of washcloths available here. Jason and I and Henry, we recently did a Tahara in Fairfield, and there they used paper towels, and I don't have a strong feeling on this. I wonder if one of the other guys does. I didn't think that was much worse, and I think it's actually probably much more cost-effective to use paper towels. So if anybody wants to have a conversation about this going forward, I am interested in having this conversation of switching to paper towels instead of disposing huge quantities of cotton every single time we do a Tahara. Again, I'm not Rabbi Zone, so I'm not weighing in on the halachic propriety of using disposable versus non-disposable. I'm just thinking about this on a logistical level. So yeah, once again, if anybody has a thought on that, please do share it with me, and we'll take it up with the board and see if maybe we can make that change. Okay, so we use the towels, we use solvents. The use of solvents is absolutely critical. The goal of the washing essentially is to get the body as clean as possible. There is a very nice image which comes from Pasuk in Kohelet. I think I put it on the next page. Here, yeah. Kasher Yetzam Mibetan Imo Arum Yeshuv Lech Kishaba, that just as a person comes into the world, they leave the world. A person comes into the world, and the very first thing that happens when a baby is born is that they're washed in the delivery room. And this has been practiced in delivery rooms since time immemorial. And we do the same. We try to make sure that we parallel to the best of our symbolic abilities the moment of birth and the moment of death. And so we wash the body. We want to make sure that it's in as pristine condition as is possible. That is very often quite difficult. Now, the use of solvents is good to get rid of things like glue, dye, nail polish. It's very effective for those things. Sometimes the most effective way is to allow it to soak, to put a towel or a piece of cotton, we have cotton balls available here, on top of the thing that you're trying to dissolve, and let it saturate for a moment before actually trying to wipe it off. But we sometimes will run into challenges where we have very delicate skin that needs to be handled with as little abrasion as possible, or we have wounds that are bleeding and can't be controlled. And for those situations, we have access to the use of adhesives and clotting solution. The clotting solution needs to be used together with an adhesive to make it work effectively, but we have access to these things here. But there are sometimes situations where it's just not enough, where there's bleeding coming out of the inside of the mouth, internal bleeding, or where we have bandages that are soaked in blood. We got to know what to do in those situations. And so this cuts into a couple of different directions. The first question is, what do we do with the blood? Right? There are oftentimes is so much blood that comes out that it's really quite noticeable. Now, it should be mentioned over here that blood that comes out of a body while it is alive does not need to be buried. And of course, we all know this because every one of us has put a Band-Aid on our own fingers in our lives and not taken that Band-Aid and brought it to a cemetery or even buried it in our backyard. But in the view of Moshe Feinstein, if a large quantity of blood comes out of a living person, or if a limb is severed from a living person, that actually does require burial. And so if we can identify that there's a large quantity of blood that emerged while the person was still alive, and it often is the case that you'll have bandages that are quite soaked, those should be included in the burial as well, to the extent that it's reasonable. We're not looking at necessarily collecting every single Band-Aid and putting it in the coffin, but if there is a soaked piece of cotton or towel, that should be included in the material that goes into the coffin at the end of the procedure. Blood that comes out while the person is actively dying, that absolutely does need to be buried, and that is not likely we're not likely to see that because, most situations are not so traumatic, but, God forbid we have an accident victim or something of that nature, could easily have a situation where all that blood needs to be collected as well. And the same thing is true also if skin scrapes off during the process. If it's a very small amount, less than what we call it kazayit in halacha, and we'll use a strict shiur on this, saying that, I'll call it quarter, I don't know what it is, 29 grams, I think is what the number that they give, which is like, it's around, what is that, a quarter of an ounce, I think. It's is that right? No. 1 ounce would be 16 pounds. I don't know, somebody want to do this math for me? Figure out what it is. It's like 3/4 of an ounce or something of that nature. In any event, if you have a substantial quantity of flesh that's removed, that needs to be buried.
An ounce is 16 grams.
An ounce is 16 grams. Okay, so 1.5 ounces is what we're talking about over here. Thank you, Bruce, for cluing our non-metric minds into the way of thinking about the world imperially. Good. So the amount that would have to be there is actually quite large. It's rare. Most of the time, things stay attached. So that's the first question: is what do you do with it? And in most instances, again, it's not going to be essential to bury it unless you can identify that it emerged during the process of dying, which is very rare. It does not need to be buried. Blood can be discarded. But there's very little harm in burying these things together with the body unless they're producing some kind of odor, in which case they should definitely be discarded. But then you have the second question, which is how do you stop it? Because as we're going to talk about in a moment, we have these tachrichin that we're trying to put on the body, and we want to make sure that they stay as pristine as possible. And one of the worst things that can happen is that we get the tachrichin on, and we realize that we did not do a good enough job of controlling bleeding, and now the tachrichin have blood on them, or they have soilage of some other kind. So what do we do about those situations? And so we have materials here that are very, very effective at stopping bleeding. Again, we have the clotting solution and we have the glue, but the most important thing that we have in our arsenal over here is what's called Webril. It's this super absorbent cotton stuff that comes in these spools, and it is always available here for use for ensuring that the bleeding can be controlled. It is not our goal to make sure that there is a long-term solution. Quite obviously, in the course of time, the person will eventually return to Earth. And in that process, every bit of blood, every ounce of tissue that is on that body will cease to be identified as a blood or as tissue. We know it's going to happen. We expect it to happen. We want it to happen. But until the burial, we'd like things to be maintained in as pristine condition as possible. From the time the body leaves the Tahara room to the time the casket is put into the ground, there's not a lot of trauma that happens. And so there's not a lot of reason to think that dressings that we put on are likely to be jostled or removed. And so the best tool that we have for controlling these things is absolutely, absolutely the Webril. Dozens and dozens of experiences have shown me that this is across the board true. The use of the clotting solution and the glue is a good first step, and if it works, then it works. But if it's not sufficient, then okay. If it's not sufficient, then we will have to resort to the Webril. Okay. Next question you have to ask very often is, what do you do about medical equipment? It's not rare to see colostomy bags or what are they? I don't know what those things are called. They put a line directly into the trachea. Tracheal line. I don't know if one of the doctors wants to chime in over here. It's not particularly essential. Yeah, Shara, what's it called?
Like a tracheostomy, tracheostomy, or a central line IV that goes into the veins of the neck.
Those are the three things that we see primarily. One is like a very large plastic hose that goes into the neck. There's a thin plastic line that goes directly, I believe, directly into the aorta. And then there's a very, it's not at all rare colostomy bags. All these things can be removed. And it's usually not a problem to take them out. Sometimes when we remove these things, you end up with bleeding, but usually we don't. And in some situations, there's a particular technique. So catheters present a unique challenge. They're always in quite tight, but once you release the pressure on them, they usually come out much more easily. So puncturing it at the end allows the pressure to be released, and then it's usually pretty removable that way. We want to try to remove as much of this foreign material as possible, and that is for two reasons, both of which are primarily symbolic, but also have some kind of functional aspect to them. The first reason is that we're trying to make sure, as I said, that the body is clean and pristine as was when it was created, and all these things were obviously not there at the moment that the body was born. And the second thing is that we would like, to the best of our abilities, to try to have equality amongst all people who are buried. And every single body, every person who was being given a Jewish burial is given, by and large, the same treatment, the same tafrichin, the same dignity. And these kinds of distinctions, leaving in medical equipment or what have you, they create very obvious differences. And so those are the two symbolic reasons. But the practical reason is that very often, particularly with respect to colostomy bags and catheters, there's a very pungent odor that you want to make sure to try to get rid of before the burial takes place. And so we want to make sure that we get rid of these things as much as we can. So in my experience, we are usually able to cut these things without too much of a problem. Occasionally, what we've had to do is to allow the line to retract into the body when we can't get a hold of the end of it, which is, if it happens, it happens. If there's residual bleeding, typically the glue and the web roll are sufficient to be able to cover it up. The question about internal cleaning is, for whatever reason, has come up much, much more in the last year than it ever has before. Somebody's hypothesis on this is that more people are choosing to die at home, and therefore they're dying actually having eaten recently. And so internal cleaning comes into two different sorts. There's internal cleaning of accessible orifices, mouth, nose, ears, and then there's internal bowel cleaning. And this is a challenge to try to do thoroughly. The Stamford Chevra Kadisha, which describes the practices of the Burial Society in Yerushalayim, he says that it was their practice to use what was essentially a balloon filled with clean water. They would force the water into the abdomen, apply pressure to the abdomen, and then check the water as it came back out into the balloon. Empty it, refill it, and they would keep doing this until the water was clean. We have access to basically an equivalent tool over here in the form of, in this facility we have a shower head, and in the facility on Summer Street we've got a hose. And these tools allow us to do a very thorough cleaning out of the internal body cavity. In my opinion, this is both necessary and doable. To simply stuff the rectum with Webril, it usually, in my experience, and somebody else can chime in if they feel differently about this, is not sufficient to mask the odor of a real problematic situation. Now, every case is different, and in many cases, it's not necessary to do anything at all. In fact, I think until recently, the standard was that the bowels would come in completely emptied in almost every case. Recently, for some reason, as I say, we're having more cases in which bowels are not emptied, and we have to manually empty them. So the strategy that we have found, which works pretty well, is, which again, it's not that different from what was described 90 years ago in the Gesher HaChaim, is to utilize water pressure, allow the central cavity of the body, really just the stomach we're talking about over here, to fill with water, and then to force it out with real strong pressure after it's been filled. And then keep doing this until the water starts to run clean. It can take a while. I'm not going to deny that. It can take, it can be a 15-minute ordeal. And of course, it's never pleasant, but it's important to remember, even as we are doing something as undignified as this, that we are here to provide dignity to the deceased, and to think of this person as a person, and to ask, what would a person want in this situation? So those are the main logistics of washing. Again, we start at the top, we go to the bottom, we start at the right, we go to the left. There are psukim also that are associated with the process of washing, and I'll talk about them more in detail at the end if we have time. All these psukim are taken from Shir HaShirim, from the end of the 5th chapter of the book of Shir HaShirim, and they, in their simplest sense, what they describe is one lover describing another lover's physical attributes. And we're saying, if we want to take this in a simplistic sense, is that this reflection of physical perfection that's described in the book of Shir HaShirim is what we see in front of us. Again, we know this is not always literally true, but if we tell ourselves it's true, then it's true enough. right? We say that the person in front of us is perfect in every way as they go on to their next world. There's more depth to it than that, but we'll leave that as a simple read. Again, on the instruction sheet, it describes that these things should be said as the body is being washed. On a halachic sense, that's not actually always practical. If the room is not clean, then the psukim cannot be recited. The chamol tefillah can, because the chamol tefillah is not psukim; it's just prayer. But there's a halacha that references to Tanakh, psukim from Tanakh cannot be recited in a room that is not clean. And so if there's still fecal contamination, the psukim cannot be said. So there is a practice that other Chevra Kadisha engage in, which is to do a first actual washing, in which the body is literally washed, where try to remove whatever is on the body, in particular focus on offensive material. And then there's a second symbolic washing, during which the psukim are actually recited each in turn. I don't believe that it is our practice to do that here. Instead, we do the washing in its full and full course, and then the reader looks at each part of the body and says, Rosh Paz, we're looking at the head, and says, Einav Kiyonim, we're looking at the eyes, etc., going down to the end of the list, Chiko Maktantiv Kula Machmadim, look at the entire body, saying everything about this person is precious. Zedudi Vizari Binot Yerushalayim. This is my beloved here, right? And so that's, it's not worse, I don't think, to do it afterwards. And so, with proper intent, it's just as good as doing it during, and it's halachically preferable to do it afterwards. So that's as far as the logistics of washing go. So at this stage, we, of course, have gone through the preparatory steps. We know that we have all of our tachrichim in order and everything we need for the burial. One thing that I didn't mention, but obviously, if we don't have this, we have a problem. There should always be a casket available to put the mate in after the burial, after the tahara is done. I have yet to be in a situation where there's no casket. If anybody else has ever had that situation, I'm interested to hear how you handled it. Hopefully, it won't happen. There are different styles of caskets, but there is always a casket available. The most standard style that we see is what we have right here, which is the plain wood box. And sometimes it comes with a two-piece cover, as you can see over there, the cover is in two pieces. And sometimes it comes with a one-piece cover, just a single wood panel that goes over the top. It's entirely made out of wood. It's secured with wooden pegs. The entire thing is decomposable in short order. Usually they're made out of pine. So it's a soft wood also, so it really decomposes very quickly. Sometimes you do find that, particularly with people who are less synagogue affiliated, particularly those who are, less connected to our community, you'll have a mahogany box. And sometimes the mahogany box is intended for viewing, and there's a metal viewing arm that goes inside of it. Rabbi Zohn's opinion is that when it comes to these boxes, even if they've got lots of satin and stuff in there, there's no need to remove them. But what I have observed here, from people who have done taharas here longer than I have, is that we do make an effort to try to strip the casket down to its barest minimum. The fact that somebody has paid money for this does not necessarily mean that it's more dignified for the deceased to be buried with a bunch of satin and an elaborate cushy pillow around them. When it comes to adding materials to the casket, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we try to keep things as plain and, again, as consistent as we can. So we want to make sure there's a casket present. We've got all the stuff that we need, and the body is now clean. So at this stage, we prepare for what really we think of as the actual tahara. The origin of the tahara seems to be... What's that?
Before we move on to this, do you just want to mention how we also cover the face and the...
Yes. Thank you for reminding me. I had some notes over here that I neglected to cover. Yes, a very important point. In an effort to afford dignity, we try to make sure that the body stays symbolically covered as much as possible. And so as soon as we take the sheet off, as soon as we take the clothing off, we put immediately a washcloth over the face and a washcloth over the genital area of the deceased in order to preserve the dignity of the person who has passed away. This is not particularly relevant in our setting over here, although it could be if there's ever a time when there are other people in the facility who are not participating in the tahara. For the same reason, we would close the door to the tahara room to make sure that we have as much privacy afforded to the deceased as is practical. So yes, thank you, Jason, for reminding me that we do we do cover the body. And the last step in washing that we always do, this again is mentioned in the Gesher Chaim specifically as a last step, is to remove whatever dirt remains under the fingernails. If you ask me, honestly, I have no idea why it's supposed to be last. That's simply how he describes it. Other books describe it as doing it first. I don't think it matters all that much. So now we get to the stage where we're about ready to perform the Tahara. And the Tahara itself comes in two different forms, both of which are not really quite Tahara in the most conventional sense of the word. The word Tahara means pure, right? In the sense of being ritually cleansed. In last week's Parsha Chukat, we read about the process of the Mechatat, in which the Para Aduma, the red heifer, is burned, and the ashes are used in some kind of a purification ritual that the Torah describes. That's Tahara. A mikvah, as similar to the ones behind a good shalom, that provides Tahara. A dead body cannot be made tahor. It's what's referred to in halacha as the avi avot hatuma. It's the most impure thing that exists. But what we're doing over here is tahara in a different sense. The origin of this, the origin of the process of doing a ritual tahara, beyond the chamol, as I mentioned, that may very well go back to the time of the Tanaim, to Hillel. The idea of washing the body is something that I believe exists in virtually every culture, and we do it too. We do it with particular guidelines as described by the halacha. But the process of doing the tahara appears to be a vestige from a time when people would, following a experience of a seminal emission, would subject themselves to what was called Tesha Kabin. Tesha Kabin is 9 kavs, which is a halachic measurement of water poured over their head. And this was a process which created something akin to Tahara, to the point that a person would then be allowed, this goes a little bit more far afield than what we need to understand for our purposes now, but that person would then be allowed to participate in ritual Jewish life again. The person would be excluded from Jewish life prior to the performing of the pouring of the Tesha Kabin. And so, what we're doing over here with the Tahara process is not actually making the body tahor. We're doing something that, on the strictest level of the halacha, is necessary only for a person who's getting back into ritual life, a person who wants to lead services again or read from the Torah again, a person who's looking to be an active member of the community. Now again, we know what we have over here, right? There is a person who is never again going to be a member of this community. And we say, as we perform the Tahara, so what? That doesn't mean this person shouldn't be prepared for that should the need arise. And so we perform the Tahara, and I cannot emphasize enough how incredibly defiant a gesture this is. To look at death and say, this is not at all the end. Instead, the next step is just as important as the ones that came before. So the Tahara needs to be done with even more gravitas than what was done before, because as we get deeper into the sense that we're doing something which defies the observable reality, we have to steel ourselves against the sense that it's not worth doing. And so the Tahara here is absolutely, absolutely worth doing. And we have two different processes that we engage in when doing the Tahara, and they require different types of preparation. We'll do different ones based on the circumstances that are necessary. Now, in the old days, and by the old days, I don't know exactly what I mean, because every single book I've seen, whether it was written in the 19th century or in the 17th century, refers to in the old days. And in the old days, apparently, they used to actually hold the body upright while performing the ritual of the pouring of the 9 kavod, the buckets of water over the head. We'll get into the logistics of that shortly. But in every practical book that I've seen written on the subject, nobody does that, because it is nearly impossible to do it, to get enough volunteers to be able to do this in a way that then make sure that the body is not going to fall, and then take this wet, slippery person and put them back on the table so that they're prepared for dressing. It's simply not practical. And so every author I've seen that writes about this laments the fact that in our modern day, nobody does it right. And would it be that we could go back to the old way of putting the body vertical? But we don't. We don't do that at all. Instead, we do a simulation of putting the body vertical. Now, we have these two tools that we use for performing the Tahara. We have the mikvah, as previously discussed, which is not really a mikvah, but it's instead just a collection of water. And we have the pouring of the 9 kavod. 9 kavod I've seen variously measured as anywhere between 4 and 8 gallons of water. These buckets that we have over here, see them here? They're 3-gallon buckets. So if we were doing 8, then we'd have to have 3 buckets nearly filled to the top. If we're measuring less, then 2/3 full is good enough. We now have 3 buckets over here. If anybody has done a Tahara with me in the past when I've insisted on doing 5 buckets, it seems that I was overestimating the value of kav. And so 3 buckets actually is sufficient for this purpose. We don't get the body upright when we perform the Tahara. Instead, what we do is we use boards to prop the body up. We have these boards. They say on them Tahara. They have been designated for this purpose. It would be better to use wood, but according to Tommy, we're not allowed to use wood by Connecticut state law. So we don't. Instead, we use these metal boards. We make sure to wash them so that they're clean and actually wet before we start doing the Tahara. Again, this is a symbolic gesture, right, to show that we would rather have the water be going all around the body, but we can't. So we put some water on these boards before we start. We position them so that the body is in contact with the boards. Put them underneath the legs, the lower part of the torso, the upper part of the torso, and if necessary, we'll do one under the head as well, although usually it isn't. So it's usually sufficient rigor mortis so that the body still stays in a rigid position. And the Tahara can then be performed. So that would be process one. Wet the boards and position the boards so that the wet board, which again needs to be wet under, is in contact with the body. And this is done after the washing has been completed. Then we prepare for the Tahara. So if we're using boards, we wet the boards and put them underneath, and then make sure the buckets are filled. And then we'll talk about what happens next in a second. If we are using the mikvah, which I think is usually the way to go, it's much easier. In almost every sense, it provides what I believe to be a greater level of symbolism towards the end of, as we described before, that kasher yatzami batanimo, just like recreating birth. So we like the symbolism of it. And it's not really important that it's not a technical mikvah because we're not technically achieving Tahara. We're doing something which is more akin to what's called the Takana of Ezra. And so I think the mikvah really is a better option. We use a hoist. And we have a electromechanical hoist here, which works quite well when it works. And here, I'm going to see if I can get at least some of it. 1 second. The hoist as we have it utilizes these kinds of straps that are a rigid plastic that go underneath the body. The one that we have at Summer Street operates with a somewhat different principle, but it's similar. And if you're ever there, you'll know how to use it. It works fine. It's not that difficult to position under the body. It's not essential to wet these boards before putting them underneath the person, the mate, because the body will separate from the board while it's actually in the mikvah. But one thing that I have seen many times when performing Taharas, which I don't like, is that some people get a little bit aggressive when sliding this edge correctly, so you can actually see what I'm doing over here, sliding this edge underneath the body. I think that strategically it's better to actually lift the body and put the plastic underneath to avoid the potential for tearing the skin. These edges are not sharp, but they are rigid, and very, very often the skin is very delicate. I have yet to have a circumstance where skin actually tore, but I'm frequently nervous about it. And so if we could all commit to trying to actually raise the body while putting the plastic underneath, I think we'd be better off for it. And all of this is done as a second step to the washing. So at this stage, we either have our boards positioned underneath the body, or we have our plastic straps positioned with the hoist. It is necessary, I think, to test the hoist every time before deciding whether you're going to use it or not. It's wonky, sometimes doesn't work. If anybody is ever in the situation where the hoist is not working, you should tell Tommy immediately. He is very responsive about getting it fixed. One thing that anybody who's done a Tahara here knows is that the cables that the hoist uses are attached to these very thick metal clasps. It'd be much better if I could show them to you, but I can't, I don't think. When using the hoist over here, it is really important to make sure that those go smoothly into the mechanical device. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. If you do know what I'm talking about, remind yourself of this while it's in operation. It's easy to forget, and if you do, you could easily mess up the hoist and then have a whole different problem on your hand. So now we've got the body either on the boards or on the hoist. At this stage, if there are 4 members present, 1 will stay in the Tahara room and 3 will leave. But no matter how many people are there, every person but 1 will leave the Tahara room momentarily. Take off the gloves, discard them, wash again, doing the 3 times washing, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. dry your hands, and this is where things get kind of annoying. Dry them as thoroughly as you can, because you got to put on gloves again at this point. We put on gloves again, obviously now, even though we feel like to some extent we've done a good job of cleaning up whatever is there, there's still the possibility of seepage and leakage, and who knows what's going to happen next, and we want to make sure to protect ourselves as best we can. So we change our gloves now, and we take off our old soiled gloves, which in many, many cases are genuinely soiled, and replace them. Now, if they're not actually soiled, I don't know a reason why they should be removed, but in both the Gesher Chaim and Rabbi Zon's guide and Rabbi Finkelstein's guide, they all say to change the gloves, and so we change gloves. Just one of those things that we do. And so we remove the gloves, we change them. And then the 3 people who left come back in. The 1 person who remained then leaves and washes his or her hands and comes back in to perform the actual Tahara. Now, in the performance of the Tahara, there's a few things to pay attention to. Okay. So maybe the most dicey one is the reading of the Psukim. So there are some very nice, very evocative, not just Psukim, but a reading from a Mishnah over here that describes what you're actually accomplishing with the pouring in the mikvah. Ma mikvah mitar et hatmeim, af HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitar et Yisrael. God Himself makes the Jewish people sanctified. We'll talk more about that at the end. And so the symbolism of this is very profound, and it's very easy to feel when you're in the room together with the mate performing the Tahara. But I think that timing really matters. And reciting these psukim either inaudibly or reciting them, after the Tahara is already done or well before it's done, it loses some of the punch. And I think that for all of our benefits, it's worthwhile for the reader to commit to reading these psukim and there's psukim in addition to the quotation from the Mishnah, in a way which can reverberate. As the Bide descends, say, that as we are throwing this water upon you, God is throwing the power of cleansing upon this person who now is going to be able to ascend to the next stage of existence in a pure and clean state. This is a powerful, powerful thing that we can do over here, and we want to make sure to do it in a way which is as most profoundly effective as it can be. Whether you subscribe again to the Chatam Sofer's notion that you're basically doing this for person unidentified, or the Zohar's notion that the person in the room can feel it, make it feel like something. That is my strong, strong recommendation. As the body descends into the water, we have the practice here of doing 3 immersions. I don't know why, but it's what we do. We do 3 immersions. We let the body go down, raise the body somewhat so that it's not fully immersed in the water, go down again, come up, go down again, come up. Right, and so that's 3 immersions in total. If I said 4, I'm sorry. 3 is what I meant to say. And then afterwards, it is very, very likely. At that point, we have one proclamation. We say Tahara or Tahara. He is pure. She is pure. We say 3 times at that moment when the body comes out of the mikvah, or when the process of pouring the water is completed. In either of these processes, there's going to be a lot of water. In the case of the mikvah, the water mostly stays in the mikvah. After the body is raised, it's very useful to spend a few seconds letting water drip off back into the mikvah before moving back over to the table. But no matter what, there's going to be a lot of water. And I don't think that there's a lot of value in trying to limit the amount of water that goes in. There are some places apparently where they try to seal the nose or the mouth before putting the water in the mikvah. I don't see a point. As far as I can tell, that water is very easily removed afterwards. It's finite, and it disrupts the process to try to seal up those orifices, and I don't know how effective it's going to be anyway. So we don't do it. We just let the water go in as it goes in. Now that's as far as the mikvah goes. If we are doing the Teisha Kavin, now again, the most optimal way of doing this would be for the body to be situated vertically and to pour consecutively 8 gallons of water in a single shot, which if you had a hose would be really easy to do, but we don't. We're using buckets. And as we use the buckets, it means that before one bucket is completed, the next bucket must begin. So if I simulate this, I'll just use the washing cups to demonstrate, right? Here I'm pouring out of one. So before this one is emptied, the guy or woman who's holding the next bucket has to get started and start pouring. The 3 buckets together, mostly full, is plenty to cover the 9 kavin. And so if we have 3 volunteers pouring, this is very easy. If we have 2 volunteers pouring, then it'll be necessary for that first volunteer to put down the bucket and to pick the next one back up. in order for the Tesha Kabin to work halachically, it's necessary for it to be Tesha Kabin Ritzufin. It's got to be consecutive, which means that there is no moment in which there is not active water pouring on the head. In this process as well, it would be most optimal to go right, left, right. If we're using 3 buckets, it's not too difficult to do this. Have the first person pouring go down the right side of the body, and when that person reaches the bottom, the right toes, the next person starts on the left side, starts at the left side of the head, goes down towards the toes, and then the right side gets a bonus pouring, when the person comes back to pour a second time. And that, fits in quite neatly with the system as we have it over here. So then the Tahara is done. At that point, we make this proclamation, Tahoru, Tahoru, Tahoru. We put the covering back over the face, take a clean towel at this point for the face and for the genitals, keeping the body, again, as carefully protected as we can. And we'll move back over to the table. The table needs to be dry. I know that many of us have the practice of putting a bunch of towels down on the table before bringing the body over. I think it's a waste of towels. If somebody else disagrees with me, feel free to disagree. In my experience with this, keeping the table dry, keeping 2 tables on the towel to absorb whatever excess moisture comes off of the body after it's placed on the table is usually sufficient. Going with a full court press of towels is just not necessary. I don't think it accomplishes anything. So but you do want to make sure the body is dry and the table is dry before you proceed to the next steps. So we've gotten a Tahara essentially done now, and now we're ready to move on to dressing. At this stage, there's going to be a lot more diversity of opinion. Everything we've said over here to this point has been pretty straightforward. The main questions, again, are about things like what to do in case of wounds, what to do in cases of excess bleeding, what to do in cases of excess filth. But what to, the basic steps they're pretty much uniform, pretty much universal. Well, the next steps is where it's going to get contentious. I hope not, but I know that this is where there's the most diversity of opinion amongst us. I'm going to say what I think, the way I've seen it done, what I think are best practices. If somebody else has a different opinion about what they believe, quote unquote, we do here, please let me know, and then we will we'll just come to some kind of agreement about what we should be doing going forward. It would be very good to make sure that we have uniform practices. But to some extent, I don't know how much it really matters. The amount of energy that goes into intellectual energy, that goes into figuring out the sequence of putting on the garments or the number of twists to do in the belts, etc., I think it may very well be misplaced. We started talking about there are things that are halacha and there are things that are minhag. I'm not even certain that the number of twists rises to the level of minhag. Right? I mean, many of us make challah, or somebody in our family makes challah. Whether you make a 4-braid or a 6-braid or a 3-braid challah, I don't think that any of us consider this to be halacha l'moshe misinai that we can't deviate from. It's just what we do. And while we might be in the habit of doing it one way, it doesn't really make any difference. And when I look in the books on this, so the most widely known book that talks about the process of doing a tahara is called Ma'avar Yabok. It was written in 1627, I think, in Italy. And the author goes into enormous lengths to describe the Zoharic concept that the body is really still a sort of mirroring the soul that is in the room. He writes extensively about the symbolism that's involved in the care for. He's got 3 paragraphs describing the washing of the hair and the kind of angels that are elevated through that process. He says almost nothing, not even a whole sentence about how to do the twists. I don't know that so much agony is necessary over this subject, and I'm saying all this because I believe that many of you have voiced this both to me and to each other, that you do feel a lot of pressure to make sure that the number of twists and the type of knots are done correctly. There's very little about this which is really critical. So once we're at this stage, we're getting to the point which is contentious, but in some sense it's also the least significant stage. So now we get to the tachrichin. Okay, moving forward over here. Right? As you can see, I put there an exclamation point. Cleanliness is key. So before we actually start the dressing, we want to make sure that we have identified and dealt with whatever sources of contamination may still be there. Now, in the process of washing, we're usually able to pretty carefully pinpoint where there is something going on, where there's skin that's split, where there is an open wound, a puncture, whatever. We're usually able to identify it, and in many cases, trying to deal with it before the tahara, whether it's the pouring of buckets or the mikvah, is not as effective as dealing with it afterwards, because the force of the water may very well dislodge or overly saturate whatever we have put on to try to deal with the problem. And so it makes the most sense to deal with these problems after the tahara has already been completed, unless you say to me, well, isn't that Tovel V'Sheret B'Yado? It makes no sense, right? You haven't actually solved the problem yet, and here you are going to the mikvah. Let's remind ourselves again that this is not a mikvah, and it's not Tahara in any kind of technical sense, and the whole thing is entirely symbolic. So if we do our best effort to try to make sure that we've covered our bases, then with a plan of covering the wounds before we go about with the dressing, we are certainly in good halachic territory. So we want to make sure that we keep everything clean. The tachrichin, take out of the package, they come in this nice box before. There it is, right? And in the box we find a number of items. We find, most importantly, one thing that you can notice immediately. All of them are white. These ones that I'm holding, ideally, again, ideally, I'm not sure what he means, but in some kind of the way that the authors write about this, ideally they're supposed to be hand sewn out of linen. And in particular, they're supposed to be hand sewn by pious old women who are post-menopause. If you want to know more symbolism about that, we can talk about it offline. Now, I don't know if that's actually the case about the Chadrichin that we get here. Says that it is, maybe it is. But they're white, which means that they're very, very easy to contaminate, right? Even the slightest amount of blood, even the slightest amount of fecal contamination, even the slightest amount of fluid that was still left in the nostrils is going to stain. And so we need to make sure before we start dealing with the dressing that these things are resolved. So we'll use Band-Aids. It's a good first step. If it works, good. We'll use Webril, as mentioned before. Webril can be used very, very effectively to plug almost anything. It can take a lot, but at some point you'll get to the stage where it seems like nothing else is going to fit, and that's usually when the Webril is really doing its job. If in the course of dressing, I put this at the bottom there, but I'll mention it right away. If in the course of dressing the tachrichin do get soiled, it really is necessary to get them clean again. And if it's really a problem, it's completely soiled, there are always extra tachrichin available in the Tahara room. In Gallagher's Summer Street, they're in plastic bins. They're kind of behind a curtain. And here on Myrtle, they are in the plastic cabinet. There's a box of them on top of the plastic cabinet in the Tahara room. They're always available. If something gets really, really soiled, God forbid, replace it. But most of the time, that's not what happens. Most of the time, you get some kind of spots. And bleach is very effective at getting rid of these things. Just soak it in bleach. It'll do the job. Maybe a minute of soaking or less, and then some abrasion will almost always get rid of whatever is there. Perfection is not attainable. We are humans. But again, we've got a person, and we want to make sure that we give this person as much dignity as we can and make that person as equal as we can to to everybody else who's in a similar position. Now, in this case, when it comes to the sequence of the garments, we go a little bit of a departure from our norm. As we mentioned in the beginning, our usual way of dealing with these things is we go right, left, and top, bottom. Which would mean, of course, that we should be starting with the top, which would be this item right here, which is the hat, the mitznefet, which goes over the head. Or in the case of the female tachrichin, I believe there is a veil, although I'm not 100% sure about that, having never actually participated in a woman's tahara. But we would be starting at the top. But we don't. That's not our practice here. Instead, we follow a much more naturalistic dressing pattern. And the reason for that is that the tachrichin as we have them, we have this large overshirt, a tonet, as we call it, or maybe we call it the mi'il. We've got a pair of pants here, michnasei bad pants that are here. We have, well, I guess we should call that one the mi'il, and we have this one, which is the undershirt, which is called ketonet, tunic, and we have a avnate, a belt that we put on as well. So the sequence that we do these things is not top to bottom. Our practice in our chevra, which is not universal, but it is our practice here, is to follow a natural dressing pattern, which is pants first, shirt, overshirt, hat, belt last. Hat last, belt second to last. And the reason for that we'll talk about in a second. But we do this because it parallels the dressing of the Kohen Gadol getting ready for Yom Kippur. And this is the second degree of symbolism that we have at this stage. So there are, one symbol, of course, is that this is a person, as described, who is in some sense still present, and in some sense, because of their presence, just deserves dignity and needs to be dressed. But on the other stage, we recognize that this is a person who is about to do something that is of cataclysmic significance, right? This is not an ordinary day for this person who is about to be buried. It's a very big day. And in some sense, we say that this person is having a personal Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur day. And just like the Kohen Gadol, the high priest on Yom Kippur, would wear linen garments, we quote those psukim. Psukim from the book of Vayikra, which describe the process of the Kohen Gadol getting ready for Yom Kippur. And because we're doing this in a way which describes we want this person to be like the Kohen Gadol, we dress in the same way that the Kohen Gadol would have dressed, which is the natural way that humans dress. We have leg ties that we use in place of the pants as we have them completely cover the feet as well. They're closed at the bottoms. And we have something which simulates putting on shoes, or socks, I guess, because the Kohen would not actually wear shoes, which we have here, and we tie around the bottom of the pants. So again, the sequence that we do it is pants, leg ties, undershirt, overshirt, belt, hat. That's the sequence that we should follow. That would be the best way to do it. But once again, if somebody deviates from that, it's not a huge deal. There is a strategy for dealing with this. Now, as I mentioned before, getting the body dry is enormously significant in making this process smooth. If you have a wet body, everybody knows this, wet skin is difficult to move fabric against. It's a lot of friction. If you have a dry body, it's much easier. So it's important to dry the body just strategically, not for any other reason, but just strategically, because the body will dry, but we want to make sure it's dry as we're actually doing the dressing. But nonetheless, you're still going to get a lot of friction, and of course, in most cases, you'll have a good deal of rigor mortis also, which makes it difficult to manipulate the limbs. And so what we do is we try to get the fabric as bunched up as possible before actually putting it on the body. I could demonstrate this now. I'm not really sure there's a purpose in demonstrating it, because anybody who does a Tahara who has done a Tahara has seen this. Anybody who hasn't done a Tahara will most certainly be not be doing it solo. And so somebody who's there with you will show you this strategy. But basically, we try to bunch it up as much as we can, and then slide up. And here also we follow, even though we're not going top-bottom, we follow right-left on this as well. So we do right leg tie, left leg tie, right arm, left arm as we pull the shirt over, and then right side of the body getting straightened, left side of the body getting straightened, etc. And when it comes to the shirt, we have a particular strategy that we use. I don't think there's any purpose in describing it. Those who have seen it know it. Those who haven't seen it, if you are going to be involved in this, you will see it. So now we get to the difficult part, which is the ties. So there are a total of 5 things that get tied on the mate. There's these 2 leg ties. There are 2 ties around the neck, one on each of the 2 shirts, the undershirt and the overshirt. And then there's the belt, which gets tied around the center. Now, the only one of these that has direct significance as a actual garment is the belt that's around the center. I did mention before that, I won't say this now. There's 7 garments in total, which I think, again, ties to the theme of 7 that you have in many aspects of Tahara, which is a gesture of completion. So the tying of the other ones, the legs and the neck ones, our practice here, I believe, is to do 5 twists. So we would take the belt and try to just demonstrate over here. We twist it around 5 half twists, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's a final twist, I guess you could call it, in doing a slip knot. Now, the only thing that is significant, and the Marbury book speaks about this at length, is that the knots should not be knots. They should be slip knots. All of them should be undone with a single pull. And the reason that's given for this is that is a nod towards the concept of Tchiyat HaMeitim. You never know when this body is going to be reanimated, and we want to make sure that, should it happen in the very near term, the body is able to undo these knots on its own and without having to have too much difficulty with it. So we tie it with the expectation that it's going to be untied. Once again, we know that's not going to actually happen in most cases, but if it were to happen, we want to make sure that it could. So we use slip knots exclusively. There's a strategy to try to make the knot into the shape of a letter shin, which is, a nice bonus thing to do. It's not that difficult to do. You just simply pull the middle part of the fabric through the loop, and then lo and behold, you can see it. We have a nice little shin over here. Shin for Kel Shakai, God who does abundant kindness with the deceased. And so when it comes to the leg ties and the neck ties, 5 half twists and a slip knot. Done. For the middle one, the avnate, as we call it, Our practice here, I believe, is to do 7 full revolutions, which is to say 14 half revolutions. Now, my own practice on this, which I'm sure I picked up from one of you, or possibly somebody who's not on the Zoom right now, but is a member of the Chevra, is to recite the pasuk Kima lecha v'yitzav elach lishmorcha b'chol derechecha, which is 7 words, while doing each one of those twists. That line taken from what's called the Shir Shel Negaim, the song for the afflicted in Tehillim, is associated a lot with the burial process, and we use it at funerals. I think that there's nice symbolism in reciting it while performing each one of these twists. In a way, we're showing that there are 7 levels of heaven that the body is preparing to ascend, and each one of these twists is another level up there. And then the final word is b'chol derechecha, in all of your ways as you are going. So whatever way you go now, you, the deceased, shall be shielded and protected. So I like that practice very much. I would be happy to know that other people are doing it, but there's very little at stake over here. All the halacha really requires, and it's not even halacha, what the minhag really requires on this is that they be slip knots. That's the absolute minhag. The number of twists is not particularly significant. As I said before, I put it into the same league as how many braids you make your challah when you're cooking for Shabbos. You might have a way of doing it, and maybe you think that way is good, and you should continue doing it that way. But if somebody else has another way, don't sweat it. But this is where appointing the Rosh for the Tahara really becomes most significant, because that person is going to make the call. Should there be any conversation about it, the most important thing, and somebody shared this concern with me, and I think that there's really a lot to be said for this. The most important thing is that kavod habriot, respect for other people, does not end with the deceased, that we share that with each other as well, and that the feeling of doing a tahara for those who are participating in it is a positive one, that we are doing this together and not in opposition to each other. So if we all come in with the same set of expectations and the same set of priorities, then we'll all be on the same page and things will go very smoothly, and it will be as good of experience as it possibly can be, given what it is. So that's really the most important thing, that there be consensus on this for each particular tahara, and the most important thing is that there be consensus that nobody's going to fight about it. So that's where I land on that. So I think that takes us through the dressing. One thing which did not mention is that in the case of a women's tahara, the convention is, I believe, to comb the hair at least lightly, and then take whatever hairs come out and put them into the casket. If I'm wrong about that, somebody correct me, but that's what I've seen written. So good. All right, excellent. So that now we have gotten to the stage where we're ready to actually put the body into the casket. So we have our own, we have our mate, and now we've got to get the two of them together. So the thing about the caskets is that they are wood. Oftentimes they have holes in the bottom, but they usually come with some straw. This particular one that I was given here for demonstration purposes actually does not have the straw. I don't know why, but they didn't put it there. The straw is intended primarily to be an absorbent material. So in the very unlikely case that there is a problem, then the straw will be there to catch whatever seepage there is. I should mention also that if it is likely that there will be seepage, which unfortunately, no matter how much we try, sometimes that is the case, we must take steps to make sure that the family of the deceased does not know about it. And so we have these absorbent pads that are available in the closet. And if we're in a situation where you know that the body is going to continue draining, you lay those out in the bottom of the casket before actually proceeding with the more technical parts of the putting the body in the aron. Good. So, as we're preparing the aron, we've got the sheet, which is here again. It's always available in the box of the tachrichin. We try to put it in at a slight angle, depending on the size of the casket that is either practical or not practical. It's not particularly important. We put the sovev, the sheet, down in the aron. We take a talit, which we had previously made pasul, and we lay it in the position that it's going to be in, right at the shoulders. The top of it, that is, at the shoulders of the deceased, and then we position the body inside the casket. So as we're positioning the body inside the casket, it's important to remember that this is a person, right? Not something to be heaved around haphazardly. Clearly, the person can no longer feel physical pain, but we act as if such a thing were possible, and we try to be as ginger as we can. Here we go head first and then legs in the normal way of doing everything top to bottom, to the extent that it's practical. So the tables that we have allow you to level the table to be almost at the exact same height as the cadaver, and then you'll be able to move successfully to take the person and put them into the aron. However, in some cases, particularly I imagine this is more of a problem on the ladies' side, some bodies are just so large that it's very difficult to deal with it that way. And here we have the hoist to help us out again. If necessary, there's no shame in using the hoist. It's totally appropriate. We try to position the body at a slight angle with the head towards the, I guess when you're facing the casket, it would be the upper right corner, the upper left corner as you're facing the casket. If it's possible, if it's not possible, it's not a problem. And we set the bait into the aron, and then we're nearly done at this point. It is our practice, which I have seen written nowhere, by the way, so I don't know who innovated it, but I like it very much, to take the string of the talit that we cut off before and put it into the right hand of the person who passed away. As if they were holding it while reciting Shema. I think it's a very beautiful symbol. And then we put shards of earth in strategic locations. So now, the places that we do it here, all that's written in the halachic sources that it should be around the head and around the genitals. But we actually do more. We put shards and earth both on the eyes and the mouth and the heart and the genitals. And we do this, our zone was particular that we should not shake the earth out of the pouch that it comes in, but instead we should sprinkle it with our fingers. I don't know why. For some reason he thought that was superior. But we do this in that sequence. Earth first, and then pottery afterwards. And once again, these things are, of course, largely symbolic to show that the body is connected to the earth, and the connection to the earth is the parts of the body that were the most sensitive. So the mouth, which of course is the most used part of our body in many cases, the eyes, which assimilate information from the outside world, the heart, and of course the genitals are, these are the manifestations of humanity that we are now showing that this person is now dedicating truly and wholly back to the service of God in the pristine sense. One last thing, which is usually not necessary but sometimes is to make sure that the eyes are closed. This is the one case where what's written about this is, I don't know if this is our actual practice. I have not had direct contact with this particular situation yet. There's a pasuk describing the death of Yaakov. It says, God is telling Yaakov that he should go down to Egypt and not worry about what happens next. He says, He says, Yosef, your son, will close your eyes. Not exactly what the pasuk means, but it does a good enough job for here, right? And so the idea that Yosef, the son of Yaakov, was specifically the one tasked with closing the eyes of his father, has led many writers to say that the best possible thing would be for a child of the deceased to be present at this moment, not necessarily to participate in the Tahara per se, but to be present for this final step of closing the eyes. I don't believe that we actually do that. If somebody wants to chime in and tell me otherwise, please do. But it's written about extensively in many sources, and if it comes up, know that it is a worthwhile practice. When we do the wrapping of the body now, the casket, as I mentioned already, is actually not the halachic burial garment. The halachic burial garment is the sovev, and that's the one that has real rules attached to it. We start just like before. We do the top right half, then the top left half, then the bottom right half, then the bottom left half, so that the body is completely closed. So that then essentially we're done. There are a bunch of psukim, which I'm not going to have time to talk about it tonight, but maybe I'll write something about it and distribute it to people who are interested in understanding why we read the psukim that we do. But the question often comes up, what about other materials? And other materials here means two different things. There's other materials in the sense of things that we talked about before, like hair that got removed or blood or whatever, right, that came out. But also there's other materials, like things that are attached to the body. Sometimes you have dentures, right, that are affixed to the body. You have to remove them. Sometimes you'll have a ring attached to a finger, or piercing that's in, a stud or whatever that's in the ear. Do we need to remove these things? Do we not need to remove them? So our general practice is that unless we have specific instructions from the family to do otherwise, everything that comes in with the body stays with the body. Now, it would be best to remove these things and put them into the casket, right? That would be the most optimal. In some cases, it's just not practical. You have a ring which is totally impossible to get off, or you just can't get access to something which is attached, then we just leave it, right? But sometimes we have other things where material has come in that we are told is important to the person that passed away or important to the member of the family, and should be buried with that person. So at this point, it becomes a little bit of a judgment call, because what's written about in the Sefer Gesher HaChaim is that really, ideally, we want consistency, right? And every burial should be the same, or at least close enough to the same as possible. And so every burial should have no foreign material, since the standard burial has no foreign material in the casket. But if it's done for the benefit of the soul of the deceased, then it's not considered a bizayon hamet. And so, the halacha in various places talks about things that would be given, put into the casket with the person who passed away to demonstrate something about the way that either that they had lived or that they had died. And it really is, it's a hard judgment call to make. What's appropriate, what's not appropriate. If somebody, comes in and they've got, an Alanis Morissette CD and they say, I really want to be buried with this thing, this is my favorite artist, it's going to be tough to try to justify that, right? But a wedding ring is a very different story. And if somebody says that they want that in the casket, then it's hard to argue with it. One thing which is a factor which should be thought about is Bal Tashchim. And to whatever extent it's possible, usually Tommy is the one who deals with this. We'll have a conversation with the family about what they care about, what they value, and what they want to be included in the burial. So rarely do we actually have to make a judgment call about this, but it should be on our minds that at least there's the possibility that it might come up, and you can usually identify from the beginning if it's going to be a problem. And if we can see from the beginning that we're going to have a situation, it's best, if at all possible, to get in touch with either Tommy or what's his name over at the other place, or the family, or Rachel. Usually the first course is just to reach out to Rachel to find out from the coordinator what we're supposed to do with those things. It happens not often, but it happens occasionally. Okay, there's some final psukim that are recited. Those final psukim are, in some sense, the most important ones, because they establish that this person is a person who has died. Of course, this was a single life, but the psukim are intended to orient our thoughts towards the idea that this wasn't just a person who has died. This is a representative of Am Yisrael, who is now going towards the Kisei HaKavod, towards the throne of glory, to appeal on behalf of the rest of Bnei Israel. And so a piece of Am Yisrael is gone, and we hope for the best for all of Am Yisrael in the future. And that's what those psukim are intended to communicate. In the end, we take the body out of the Tahara room, we wheel it out head first. On almost every situation, the casket will have a Magen David, a Star of David, on it that always points towards the feet. So that's just one way of identifying what the top and the bottom of the casket is. We've got a velvet cover that goes on top of it. We have our final paperwork to fill out. We have a Mechila text where we ask, which is, it's written out here, but I'm going to write a new document, which we'll start distributing for every Tahara, which is a text in which we ask the deceased for forgiveness if we did anything that in some way diminished the dignity of the deceased, which, it's always possible that we did something wrong, or we did something that we thought was right but turned out to be wrong, or we just weren't serious enough in the moment. So we ask for forgiveness. We don't anticipate a response to that, but we ask for it with all of our hearts nonetheless. And then we leave. Upon leaving, there are two steps that you should take. Of course, dispose of all your PPE. Wash your hands thoroughly. There's always Purell available, and it's a good idea to wash with soap. And then ritually wash afterwards the same way that one washes after leaving a cemetery. They are usually pretty good about leaving water outside for that purpose. All right. There's a second piece what I wanted to talk about over here, which is the meaning of the psukim. I see that we're not going to have time for that tonight, but I'll take questions at this point if anybody has any. Not a one, huh?
I'm sorry, it's Shara. I just wanted to say half a sentence about making sure everybody has hepatitis B vaccines and tetanus shots if they're participating. And just speak to your doctor, or you can speak to me about that. I know that that's not what this is about, but just making sure everybody's up to date.
That's 100% what this is about, Shara, and thank you very much for the reminder. We don't do ourselves any favor by imperiling our safety. Rabbi Zone, I think we talked about this, 2.5 years ago, at some length. The fact is, very few pathogens are airborne, but hepatitis is bloodborne, and yeah, of course, Dr. Israel is correct in reminding us that we should protect ourselves not only through PPE, but also through vaccination if we're going to be participating in Taharas. Thank you for the reminder, Dr. Israel. And yeah, we should, I guess I should take my own advice and verify that my own vaccinations are up to date on this as well. All right, any other questions, comments?
Yes, I have a question as far as the water with the buckets.
Mhm.
When you start on the right, do you have to make sure that every facet of the body is covered, or do you just throw it as is? I've seen two videos that have different opinions.
You know, let's remember that this is kind of a shadow version of the real thing, which would be pouring it from the head down. If you were to pour from the head down, you cannot guarantee that every single inch of the body is necessarily going to be hit by that water. The only way you get full coverage is through immersion. And even then, you don't even necessarily know that you get full coverage of everything. So I definitely do not think that it's necessary for every single thing to be hit by the water. It doesn't hurt, but it's not necessary at all. And so it's enough just to try to go in a general contour down the length of the body. So yeah, if somebody said otherwise, I'd be interested in hearing an explanation. But the most important thing is that the water be poured consecutively, that there be water in contact with the body throughout the entire process. Okay, did that answer the question? I think it did.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay. What is the practice when a person has a tattoo? We change nothing. I mean, you know, a person with a tattoo, the halacha does not allow tattooing under most circumstances. It's called ketiva ka'aka in the language of the Torah, in the language of the Mishnah, and it's prohibited by the Torah. But the fact that a person has done something which is prohibited by the Torah does not stop us in any way from doing a full tahara. So we change nothing. You know, the only issue is that the presence of a tattoo, particularly if it's very extensive, can sometimes make it difficult to identify whether there's still bleeding or adhesive or seepage. So we just have to take extra care in the area where the tattoo is to make sure that we're doing as thorough a cleansing as possible. But no, we change absolutely nothing. I believe that is uniform practice throughout all Chevra Kadisha everywhere, but I know for sure that is our practice here. All right. Any other questions?
Naftali, I have a question from Diane Cohn. She's not on the call, but she wanted me to ask it anyway.
Yep.
We wanted you to address which things, like bandages, tubes, should we put in a casket and which can be thrown out. Sometimes those items have blood on them, and if a person starts bleeding, which items go in the casket.
Yeah. Well, I talked about this before, but you're right. This is one of the most frequent things that comes up. Blood that comes out while the person is still alive, just absolutely on a straightforward halachic level, unless there's a ton of it, does not need burial, right? And that can be discarded. Blood that comes out after the person dies, if there's a lot of it, doesn't have to be that much, but if it's a noticeable, measurable amount, should be put into the casket. Now, what's noticeable and measurable? So I don't really know. I mean, what was the number? I think Bruce had included us in here before. 30 milliliters, right? Something in that neighborhood. It's a pretty sizable amount of blood. I mean, we're not talking about drops over here. So all those things should be removed. All of those tubes basically should be removed, and they should be discarded. They can and should be removed in almost every case. What will happen in some cases, and you and I have seen this for sure, is that when there's continued bleeding, something will get saturated. The saturated cloth should be put into the casket. It would be best to try to put it into the casket in such a way that it's not going to cause filth. Right, so that would mean that we've got to put it inside of a bag or something, or wrap it in one of the waterproof things that we have over here before putting it inside of the aron to make sure that it doesn't contaminate anything. But basically, all of those, every part of those medical equipment pieces, they should all be discarded. All, not one of them should be going into the casket together with the mate. All right, questions? How do we get to be to call for Tahara? It's a great question, and the answer to that is tell Rachel Atar, basically. If you send me your contact information, I will forward it along. But thank you very much for volunteering, or at least expressing intent to volunteer. It's very kind and generous of you. Okay, any other questions? None? All right. Good. Okay, now this was recorded, so you can let people know that it's available in a recording. I am, as I said from the beginning, not really an expert on this subject. If you find something that disagrees with something that I said, it's possible that that was an active disagreement, but it's possible also that the other person is right. And so you should let me know, and I'll revisit the topic, and we can move forward from there. All right. Anything else? Oh wait, we got one more comment over here. All right, excellent. Thank you, Linda. Great. All right, fine. With that, I wish everybody good evening. Tiskul and mitzvot, and we say, as always, Yibala Chaim L'Netzach, that we should experience no more death in the future, and no more sorrow in any of our lives and in the lives of any of our families. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi Naftali.
One last thing, if anyone is interested, if you have never performed a Tahara and you are interested in doing so, please let me know. You all have my email. This is Jason Levine. Please let me know, and we'll make sure to get you onto the list with Rachel. What happens is the next time there's a Tahara, or whenever you are available and there's a Tahara, you'll be called upon to be an observer, and you'll be able to observe and participate as much as you want in a Tahara. And then after that, we will come back to you, ask you if this is something that appeals to you to continue doing in the future, and then you'll just be added to the regular list. And as Taharas, as the need for a Tahara comes up, Rachel will reach out, and if you are available, you can volunteer to participate in the Tahara.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi Wolf. Thank you, everyone, for joining.